Good evening, everyone. My name is David Fryson. I'm the pastor of the New First Baptist Church in Charleston, West Virginia. I'm also the recently retired founding vice president for the Division of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at West Virginia University. And I would like to thank West Virginia's Future for putting on this event tonight. As a native West Virginian, as a current resident of West Virginia, I think it's very important that we have these type of events in West Virginia, and so we're very appreciative of this opportunity. Tonight, we'll be talking about D.C. statehood. And D.C. statehood is an issue that has been growing around the country in conversations and in West Virginia. Many of you may know that West Virginia is often talked about because of the way that West Virginia was created out of another state, and it was of questionable constitutionality, at least at the time. Just last week, the Senate Homeland Security and Government Affairs Committee held a hearing on statehood for the District of Columbia. Interestingly and importantly, there are over 700,000 residents of Washington, D.C. These are teachers and business owners and fishermen and service industry workers. 45.4% of the population is Black, 5.2% is Hispanic white, and 4.1% Asian, which gives a minority population of the district of 54.7%. It was not until 2011 that African-American population dropped below 50% in Washington, D.C. Some of these families in D.C. go back more than 5 generations. And more than 30% of the people in D.C. are native Washingtonians. Yet, without statehood, the people of the District of Columbia have no representation in Congress. And even worse, that Congress can decide to overturn local laws and local spending and decisions that are made by district officials who have been elected by district residents. Tonight's expert panel will help explain some of this. We will be talking about the history, the roots and race, and the potential solutions that are available. I am thrilled to be joined by 3 experts on Washington, D.C. Tonight's panel, first, we have Chris Myers-Asch, who is a co-author of Chocolate City, A History of Race and Democracy in the Nation's Capital. He's also a visiting instructor at Colby College in Maine. Next, we have with us Dr. Ravi, who is a member of the Board of DC Vote, a leading statehood organization. Dr. Perry is also the political science chair at Howard University. And finally, we have Counselor Monica Hopkins, who is the executive director of the ACLU in the District of Columbia. I want to thank each and every one of you for being with us tonight. And shall we get started? First, Chris Asch, your book, Chocolate City, is seen as one of the definitive histories of DC, especially from the perspective of how race shapes democratic governance in this country. Can you give us a primer? Can you talk about how we got here with DC residents not having representations? And was that really what the founders had intended?
Well, I appreciate your question, Pastor, and I'm so glad to be here with a great panel. Really appreciate your interest because the people of DC don't have the power to make this happen, to be quite honest, and the people of West Virginia do, and that's kind of the root of the problem. You asked a great question about, was this something that the founders intended? And the answer is really no. Because what happened during the founding era with the writing of the Constitution and the citing of DC, the nation's capital on the shores of the Potomac, is that there were 2 warring principles going on that explain why DC residents were stripped of the right to vote. And one is that national leaders like Alexander Hamilton, George Washington, these men who wrote the Constitution, they wanted the seat of the federal government to be independent, to be on its own, away from the influence of any particular state. There were people in Pennsylvania who wanted the capital in Pennsylvania. People in New York wanted it in New York. but most of the folks who came to the Constitutional Convention were determined to put the capital in a site on its own, where the federal government would have what they called exclusive legislation, exclusive jurisdiction, where the federal government alone would be able to dictate the power, because they did not want to have the federal government be subservient to any state. And that explains a lot of what's going on in the Constitution. So in Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution, they write that in this district, the federal government will have exclusive legislation. So that principle of exclusive legislation was very important to the founders. But of course, this was the generation that just fought a war on the principle of no taxation without representation, right? The idea that no people should submit to a government that they have not had a say in forming themselves. And so these very same people who believed in exclusive legislation also believed very strongly that there should be no taxation without representation. So what do? How do you account for a federal district, the seat of the federal government, that has no right to vote? At first, when they were building the government, it wasn't a problem. People who lived eligible voters, meaning white men of property, who lived on the Maryland side of the Potomac, voted in Maryland elections, for Maryland senators. Folks on the Virginia side voted in Virginia. That right was stripped away in 1801 as part of a consolidation of national power. And so what happened is one principle was preserved, exclusive legislation, but the other was ignored. No, taxation without representation. And so many founders were appalled by this. James Madison writes that, of course we're going to do this, but it never happens. And so actually the statehood bill as currently written, is a way to reconcile these two principles that are at the very core of the founding of the country, because it would preserve the federal district as a place where the federal government has exclusive legislation. It just shrinks the size of that district down to about 2 square miles. So the Constitution says, look, this district can't be more than 10 miles square. And the founders drew 10 miles square. But of course, if you look at the map, it's not a square today, because in the 1840s, in part because of concerns about the abolitionist movement, Virginia residents on the Virginia side of the border asked to be retroceded back to Virginia. And Congress said, sure. So the district shrank from 100 square miles down to 68. That's where we are today. The statehood bill would shrink that federal district down further and say the federal government has complete authority over its own seat of government, the Capitol complex, White House, all the federal buildings downtown where there are no residents. But the rest of the city, the other 66 square miles, becomes the 51st state. And that's a way for residents of the District of Columbia to have to not endure taxation without representation anymore, and preserve the principle of exclusive legislation. Race actually does not come into it for the founders, simply because they could not imagine a political arena in which Black people played a part. Right? This is the generation that put slavery into, that preserved slavery and practiced it on the streets of Washington, D.C. They couldn't imagine that Black people would ever have the right to vote. That comes later. We'll talk about that later with the disenfranchisement during the Reconstruction period. But we'll get to that later, because I know that you have lots of other questions. I think you're still on mute, Pastor.
Sorry about that. Am I on now? Can you hear me now? As I was asking the question, as an attorney, one of the things that I don't give much scope to is original intent, because we know what the original intent was. The original intent, 3/5 of a person for taxation purposes, women not voting, freeholders not voting. So I appreciate you putting that into a context, for a historical context for us. Dr. Perry, Howard University, as we all know, is one of the leading HBCUs in America, and is a key component for the DC community. From your perspective, how does DC's lack of statehood fit to the challenges to voting and representation that we are seeing around the country?
I appreciate the opportunity, Pastor, and with everyone else here to be on this really important discussion. I think it's absolutely right what Chris was saying earlier, that West Virginians have the power to make this happen, and residents like me of the District of Columbia, can use their voice. We have the bully pulpit, but that's about all we've got in order to make this happen. And proud to represent, DC Vote, who has been doing the work of statehood for decades here in the District of Columbia, and has been in the front lines of multiple iterations of national legislation moving toward where we are today, where we have a bill on the floor that, first of all, in the House got over 200 something co-sponsors. Even the ceremonial gesture of the Speaker of the House co-sponsoring the bill, which normally doesn't happen, was done in this case with Speaker Pelosi doing so. And so it's a really unique opportunity where we are now. And from the perspective of Howard, of course, being the Mecca and HBCU, I think what I understand about DC history, there's about 3,000 or so people in DC at the time when it was originally given the 100 square miles that Chris was talking about earlier. About a third of them, by the time we got to Reconstruction, where residents were Black. And so it's always has been, even though founders did not, of course, possibly conceive of having many of their slaves, for some of them, being voting members of society. When we recognize the fact that from its inception, DC, whatever you think of it and its history, has included Black people, then it really does become a central racial justice issue from the beginning. And that even in the Reconstruction era, where Blacks were roughly, I think, a third of the DC's population, generally this has been an urban or regional enclave where there's been more Black people here than elsewhere vis-a-vis the rest of the country. And the density is still the same, while the population has changed because of a lot of different migrations over the past several decades. Obviously, gentrification being a huge part of that. The population still is a majority minority city that, again, obviously should be a state in the way that we think of it. And the Black population is roughly 46, 47% now, which mirrors a lot of other cities nationwide that have had historically kind of higher levels of Black population in the, let's say, 70s or 80s, and have seen that population drift off. And DC certainly is among cities such as Detroit or Atlanta, or even nearby Baltimore, as examples of those shifts in Black population. So the challenge in terms of representation for DC statehood is a perennial challenge that has always engaged African Americans. And this is, I think it's just important to emphasize that this current iteration of statehood, where we've gotten so close, and we just have a little bit further to go, is really just another generation effort. We have seen generations of efforts for DC statehood, and there have been African Americans a part of that effort ever since the inception of the inequality given the residents here in the District of Columbia. And of course, we began to see some change in the mid-60s with the 23rd Amendment, giving folks here the right to vote in the presidential election. And of course, that's a significant year in terms of politics, because it's the first year in 1964 where we began to see the shift of the political parties as we know them to be today. And in the election of course, Johnson over Goldwater. And so this is a continual challenge, it's a perennial challenge, But it does seem as though, because of the work of so many coalition partners, and of course, including DC Vote, that we are really, really close. And so I want to keep the message hopefully positive that we can really, it's possible to achieve this, but we certainly need some particular help there in West Virginia.
Well, West Virginia, from this vantage point, is certainly behind the effort. And we are hoping this is a generation that finally pushes this over the finish line for equality and justice in our generation. Councilor Monica Hopkins, there's been significant pushback on the constitutionality of statehood. And as I mentioned in my opening, I'm in West Virginia, and there's always been a question about the constitutionality of the state of West Virginia, but no one seems to be clamoring for West Virginia to lose its statehood. But the idea that there might need to be a constitutional amendment before the District of Columbia can be a state. I've read that recently some 40 legal scholars, the Congressional Research Service, your organization, the ACLU of D.C., you have all studied this issue and you've written about it at length. Can you help people understand why statehood as proposed is constitutional?
Well, first of all, thank you, Pastor Fryson, and I'm really honored to be on this panel with folks I deeply respect and be invited to West Virginia to, at least virtually, to talk about DC and DC statehood.
Wonderful.
You know, I think part of this, like Chris stole a little bit of my thunder here in explaining the constitutionality and did it very well, which shows that, you know, it's not, you know, it doesn't take a lawyer to understand what the Constitution says, right? And if you look deeply at the Constitution, it literally says that that the federal district shall be no more than 10 miles square. And so the proposal that is in front of Congress reduces that size. And additionally, you know, so that's one argument that we couldn't do that. That's a constitutional argument, like, oh, you can't do that. The second argument is that, well, you know, it's the admissions clause of the Constitution. You can't create a state, you know, in the jurisdiction of another state, but that's not what we're doing here, right? Like, there is no existing state here. What we are actually doing is taking the, you know, what is now known completely as the District of Columbia. We are carving out about the, you know, the 2+ miles for the federal district, which would be called the U.S. Capitol, and preserve the Capitol, the White House, all of the monuments, everything you think about when people, you know, when visitors come to DC and spend a lot of time there. And, you know, I, for one, as a DC resident, usually try to circumvent that area to get around it, because it's heavily trafficked with visitors. And there is, you know, there is a whole city outside of that with 700,000 residents that do not have the right to vote. That is a population that is, you know, bigger than 2 other states. And we have a city budget that is larger than about 14 states. And so I think these are things that people don't understand and don't know. So those are the 2 constitutional arguments. And then people say, well, you know, if you want a right to vote, you should be retroceded into Maryland. You should be, like you said, with Virginia, you should be given back to Maryland. And Maryland doesn't want us. And that land, the land that once belonged to Maryland, was actually given to Congress to create what is now the U.S. what is the District of Columbia. And so there is, you know, no reversionary government interest. That's what we say. So basically there is no interest here that would require Congress to go back to Maryland and say, do you officially give this to us? Because they already gave it to Congress to decide what to do with this land. So those are like the deep constitutional arguments, but essentially no other state in the United States has ever had to have a constitutional amendment to add them as a state. West Virginia didn't have to do it. Kentucky didn't have to do it. So that's sort of where the constitutional arguments stand.
Absolutely. As you were speaking, the arcane rule against perpetuities jumped in my mind for some reason, something that we all talk about, but nobody completely understands. Chris, coming back to you, focusing a bit more on the racial justice piece and the racism of denying statehood. I read at one point in D.C., white residents decided to give up their own representation to ensure that Black Washingtonians no longer voted. Is that right?
It is, and now this is local representation that we're talking about here. So after that period where I told you that the residents of DC had their rights stripped away, and so they couldn't vote at all after the Organic Act of 1801, many folks in the district complained. They were complaining, making many of the same arguments that we're making today about no taxation without representation and that DC interests will be ignored and so on and so forth. They clamored enough that Congress granted the city a municipal government, a local city government. And so up and through the Civil War into the Reconstruction period, DC had a municipal government, a local government, city council, they called it a board of aldermen, an elected mayor, and so forth. What happens during Reconstruction was really this remarkable time, probably the most misunderstood and overlooked period in American history, but really one of the most important ones to understand the times we live in now. And so after the Civil War, and during the Civil War, DC it was the capital of the Union Army. It was like a magnet for people fleeing slavery and looking for freedom. And so tens of thousands of former slaves crowded into the city, searching for opportunity, searching for freedom, sometimes searching for family. And the whole city is booming because of the war. And coming out of the war, radical Republicans in the Congress, they don't have the Southern Democrats to worry about anymore. They're able to push through a series of laws that are really remarkable for their time. In 1862, radical Republicans emancipate enslaved people in DC. They're the first freed in the whole country. This is 9 months before the Emancipation Proclamation. They establish a Black public school system, really in advance of what's going on in the rest of the South, because DC culturally is part of the South. Then, as the war ends, radical Republicans decide that really to make freedom real, Black men need the right to vote. And they put that as H.R. 1, the number one bill that they introduced following the war when Congress reconvenes in 1865.
Goodness.
Pass it, it gets vetoed. They pass it over President Johnson's veto. And in February 1867, Black men in the district are the first Black folks to cast ballots. And when they do, they immediately upend the whole political calculus of local DC politics. And first of all, they come out in droves. They register in droves in higher percentages than white residents. In 1867, in the very first election in Georgetown, they throw out the racist mayor who had argued against emancipation. Then in 1868, they elect a white abolitionist as the mayor of Washington. By 1869, the Board of Aldermen has Black men sitting on it. They're Black men holding elected office from every ward in the city. It is truly a remarkable transformation. You have men like George Hatton, who in 1862 was enslaved. By 1869, he's sitting on the Board of Aldermen. He is making decisions for the city. They passed the most progressive racial equality legislation the country's ever seen. It's essentially the 1964 Civil Rights Act is passed at a local level in DC. And so it banned racial discrimination in all public establishments. These remarkable laws, which were later dropped from the DC Code, were resurrected in the mid-20th century as part of the 20th century civil rights movement. But in 1869, DC's on the cutting edge of an interracial democracy, unlike anything this country, really the world, has ever seen. white conservatives in the city never supported emancipation, never supported black suffrage. And truth be told, they really didn't like the expansion of suffrage to poor white men either. They didn't like the whole Jacksonian democracy of letting poor white people vote. And so you had men like Alexander Shepard, who becomes the most powerful figures, a wealthy businessman, former slave owner. And he helps lead basically a counter-revolution. And it's a two-step retreat from democracy. First of all, in 1871, they convinced Congress to create a territorial government, which you all may know is usually the first step towards statehood. But in this case, it was the first step towards what happens in 1874, which is complete disfranchisement. And the argument that the white conservatives say is, look, we gave black men the right to vote and they went wild. They elected these crazy politicians who spent our money, who drove the city into the ground and were completely corrupt. This is the same argument they're going to use against all the Reconstruction legislatures across the South. In DC, they said, you know what? The best thing to do is just to disfranchise everybody and turn this over to a commission form of government. So the whole city government was run by three people, three white men. They were all white men until the 1960s when the first black man was appointed. No woman ever served as a commissioner. So three presidentially appointed white men, one Democrat, one Republican, and one from the Army Corps of Engineers. Those three men controlled the city until the 1970s. And here's the thing, DC residents kept fighting to get both what we call home rule, local self-government, and national representation. There were often interracial coalitions of workers fighting for this. And every time they did, the conservatives played the race card. They said, look, we tried that back in Reconstruction and look what happened. It was crazy. It was corrupt. We don't want that to happen again, do we? And they would consistently say, if you enfranchise black people, they will hold the balance of power because white people would be split between two parties and whoever the black voters vote for is going to win. And so black people would hold disproportionate power. And they said, if you do that in DC, black people will run this city and we don't want that. And this happens in the 1890s when the labor movement tries to win the right to vote, happens in the 1910s where there's a push around World War I, where local business leaders, newspaper, white leaders try to win back the right to vote. The conservatives say, no, we'll have black rule, what they called Negro domination of the government. In the 1930s, again, there's another push. Again, they play the race card and they say, look at what happened in Reconstruction. Now, here's the ultimate irony. There was corruption. There was big spending. And you know who did it? Alexander Shepard, the same guy who was running the counter anti-democratic revolution. He was the one who ran up the bill and Congress stepped in. And because of all this overspending by Alexander Shepard, they stripped the right away from both black voters and white voters. And that was the way it was until after Selma, after the assassination of Dr. King. It wasn't until late 1973 that DC even got home rule again. DC people could even vote for their own city government.
It's amazing how race has played a part literally in all of our decisions. And now to see the repression of black votes around the country is eerily reminiscent to the structure that you just told us about. One quick note that I've always been interested in those early days of DC, during Abraham Lincoln's second inaugural, there were many freed slaves that attended that inaugural. And one of the reporters reported that there was a strange phenomena going on because as Lincoln was delivering his address, the people in the audience seemed to be talking back. We call that in the church call and response. So Dr. Perry, I wanted to get a little even more political for just a minute. Can you talk about the oppositional arguments to DC statehood and how they compare to arguments that were used against the admissions of other states? Is this just a retread of old arguments, or are we on new ground here?
Yeah, Pastor. I think that's a great question. Forgive me, the professor in me wants to make sure that we also remind our attendees that they can put questions in the Q&A box as well. But this question is so important because it highlights the way in which social movements work, in which we often do have to respond to what we call oppositional politics. And in this current iteration, in many ways, the arguments of opposition look just like Chris was describing from Reconstruction era, in that they have said, on the one hand, well, DC doesn't have a car dealership, and every state has a car dealership. And so, because first of all, that's false. We actually do have a car dealership in DC. But right, the idea that is a litmus test for statehood has become a rallying cry of some as well. And then, of course, there's the alleged belief that you need to somehow amend the 23rd Amendment, amend the Constitution essentially in order to make DC statehood possible. And of course, that is suggesting a bar that we've reached before. I mean, we haven't amended the Constitution much. We really haven't amended it, 17 or so times, since 1791. But nonetheless, it is still a high threshold that the opposition is trying to suggest. Well, that's what you need to do now in order to get statehood. So that's another argument. And then a third argument that you hear, I think, commonly from folks is that, well, this is not something that Congress should be doing. It's a jurisdictional kind of argument. That says that, well, yes, while the other 37 states were admitted via majority of a congressional vote here, this is something that maybe needs to be resolved by the Supreme Court or something. All right. And so which ties into the conservative effort over many decades to pack the courts in anticipation of some of these types of challenges as it relates to their ideological preferences. And so those are, I think, some of the three arguments. What's the thread between each of those arguments that's not being said? And it's the undercurrent of race that is consistent throughout. What we know is that the decades of various movements and iterations of bills presented to Congress relative to statehood have been colored by the population that would be given new kinds of rights in the minds of politicians in Congress. And of course, those people have been mostly African American. And because now today, we also know, again, post the partisan realignment in 1964, that 90% or so Democrats of African Americans vote for the Democratic Party and identify as Democrats. Then the suggestion of granting a statehood then becomes a purely political question, which has interest not about they flip the argument. The uniqueness about the oppositional arguments is that the effectiveness of them then tries to flip the kind of playing field of the debate on statehood. And so they would rather talk about those issues than discuss the challenges that they are bringing to the actual Democratic and Republican experiment, which is our democracy here in the United States. And so they don't want to have that discussion. And so instead, they are pushing these other kind of oppositional arguments, which are all steeped in their understanding that this population that currently resides in DC, it's what we may call episodic politics as well. This population that currently resides in DC votes a particular way. And because of that, by us granting them this statehood as if it were a gift of some kind, right? That would be giving away their own political advantage. And these oppositional arguments are meant to distract from that reality.
Excellent points. I really appreciate that analysis. I keep looking for the constitutional provisions for car dealerships that would be necessary for a new state. Professor, we really appreciate you reminding us that for the listeners that you have an opportunity to write questions, and those of you that have questions, we're asking all questions must be submitted via the Q&A. So if you have questions, you can start revving those up. But I have one last question before we let the audience members chime in with their questions. And so first, I'm gonna ask Monica. The 23rd Amendment gives the federal district 3 electoral votes. How does that come into play? Does it need to be repealed before statehood?
I'm glad you asked this question. So the 23rd Amendment, as Chris sort of primed us at the very beginning, what is it? So the 23rd Amendment allows the residents of the district to pick their electors and vote in the presidential election. And that provision says the residents of the District of Columbia and the president and their family. So I just want to set a baseline of what it actually is. Okay. So the admissions bill, the DC Admissions Act, includes a solution to any constitutional issue that the 23rd Amendment might raise, because you might think, what happens to this if, we shrink the federal district to have the US Capitol? Wouldn't that leave the president and their family and anyone who resided, which no one resides in that, what would be the US Capitol or federal district once it's reduced? Wouldn't they have an outsized ability to have 3 electors to, vote for president? Well, once you shrink that, there is a provision in the DC Admissions Act that's in Congress that would repeal the legislation granting the district a method of choosing those electors. So it wouldn't be self-enacting, right? Like they wouldn't just say, oh, great, we're going to now vote for president. And it would create an expedited process to repeal the 23rd Amendment. And what we have to, what we sort of have to look at here is that, these concerns about the 23rd Amendment are really sort of like that, oh my gosh, we have to do something about that before this other thing happens, are completely without basis. Because, many parts of the Constitution are redundant. Literally, they might be obsolete, they might be unrepealed, they're there. And so we have this existing problem. And yet in the DC Admissions Act, there is a provision that provides for, okay, take away the ability to, grant those electors. It's not self-enacting. So literally Congress would have to give the new federal district the right to set up an election scheme that would allow them to, how do you vote? Where do you vote? How do you select the electors for president? Congress would have to proactively pass legislation to allow this to happen for the new district. And in the DC Admissions Act, there is a provision for expedited removal. So all of these arguments are basically fear-based arguments because we hold voting so seriously that, of course, in this country, we would not want to give such a limited number of people, namely the president and their family, undue influence to vote for the presidency, right? Like that is sort of what is there. But it raises in us as people the fear that that might happen without the actual basis that in our democracy, the way we are set up and what it would take, that it could actually happen.
It's amazing the straw grasping that people seem to be having now, especially since there does seem to be significant momentum for DC statehood. Well, I would like to remind the audience that we are accepting questions, and just if you have questions, put them in the Q&A. Put them in the questions and answers. So our first audience question is: did the founders really not want the Capitol to belong to anyone else? Just really a kind of sibling rivalry?
Well, I can take that, since I was talking about that issue earlier. So what part of what they were worried about was when the Capitol was in Philadelphia early on, during the early form of government, the Articles of Confederation, there was an incident that happened in 1783 where the Pennsylvania state, veterans from the Revolutionary War marched on the state capitol. The state capitol happened to be, the Pennsylvania State House happened to be where the U.S. Congress was also meeting. And these soldiers wanted their back pay. They hadn't been paid. And they had this raucous protest outside the State House. What was actually happening, was interesting, is that they were protesting to the Pennsylvania state government. They didn't bother with the U.S. Congress because the U.S. Congress had no power, didn't even have the power to tax. The U.S. Congress had no money. And so it was sort of an insult to the Congress to say, we're not even protesting you, we're protesting to our state government because they're the ones who have the money and the power. Alexander Hamilton and other delegates in the Congress were humiliated by this and used this as a pretext to say, look, imagine what could happen if we, the Pennsylvania state government won't come in and protect us, right? Because he went to this governor and he said, look, break up this protest. And the governor said, no, I'm not going to do that. These are veterans. They're just protesting. And so the U.S. Congress couldn't get the Pennsylvania state government to ostensibly defend it. And so they used this incident and they said, look, if the federal government is in a state, then that federal government is going to be subservient to whatever state that is. It's going to depend on whatever state it's in for its own protection. And that's just not right. And so they used that 1783, they called it the Pennsylvania Mutiny, as an argument for what they called exclusive legislation.
Okay. Well, West Virginia over the past few weeks has been kind of ground central for the discussion of For the People Act. And that is because of our Senator Joe Manchin. I've lately been calling him Can't Get Right Joe, has been sort of pushing back and not allowing this to go through. So Dr. Perry, how does statehood connect with For the People Act?
Well, one, it all dates back to what happened on January 6th. The other thing that happened, other than the Capitol insurrection, was that two people won in Georgia in the Senate race runoff who happened to be Democrats. And that solidified a shift in power for the U.S. Senate. And really, for the first time in modern American history, we have a Senate that's literally split down the middle, 50-50. And we have, of course, the tie being broken by Vice President Kamala Harris, who I will proudly say is a proud alum of Howard University and our political science department, and as well. But the challenge for the Washington D.C. Admission Act and the For the People Act is the same, in that because the Senate has the tie that it does, and the Senate is an institutional body that is governed by rules, and the rules are generally compiled by the majority leader. In this case, you may remember that a former majority leader, now minority leader, Mitch McConnell, through somewhat of a fit in the transition of power and did not relinquish immediately. It really did not get a lot of media coverage, but it resulted in Chuck Schumer basically sharing power for a while. And all of that, in many ways, arguably was the kind of pressure that the Democrats now have at attempting to maneuver any legislation through when you have this wonderful concept of a filibuster that stands in your way. And the only way that either the DC Admission Act or the For the People Act that many people believe has a shot at going through and actually getting passed, becoming law, has to do with changing the rules relative to filibuster. And the joy of being a political scientist is that, this is why we always argue that politics is essentially everything, and that ultimately we view things through the lens of institutions. Because any major progress or goal or effort for any group, or in this case for the 700,000+ people in DC, is likely going to have to go through Congress. And Congress is the institutional body that we have been actually decreasing our public education of in states that have historically been recently electing Republican governors, in states like West Virginia, where then in many instances they appoint conservatives to state boards of education, which have led to a decrease in civics and diversity kinds of education, particularly at the high school level throughout the country. So now you have a large group of generations of Americans who literally do not know that there are 3 branches of government, for example. And so and I mentioned, I take the time to explain this to hopefully remind all of us that this is not by happenstance, that this occurs through politics. And it ultimately comes to gets down to our local and state political issues. And so the connection to the DC Admission Act and the For the People Act is that both of them, first of all, are about extending voting rights to African Americans primarily. And so that's one way of looking at it. And granting more equal representation in our American political processes, particularly for those groups, and obviously for other groups as well, and for everybody. But that, in terms of targeted politics, they're both bills that really do advance the opportunities for our voting procedures in this country, particularly given what happened with Shelby v. Holder. It gives them the best opportunity to actually be somewhat equal, as close as we can make it in the absence of a Supreme Court decision. And so that's another way of looking at it. But I will end by saying that the real challenge still has to, because we have the 50-50 Senate and because we have a midterm election coming up in a year, really in the mindset of many, what that ultimately means is that if the Democrats are unsuccessful at convincing, I think, a lot of their constituents on how important it is to pass some of these issues, then they may be forced to try to do what many of them really don't want to, including your senator in West Virginia, and actually shifting this filibuster rule. For some reason, many people view it as endemic to the American political kind of framework, despite the fact that it's not at all. But I'm not the historian in the room, but I can certainly suggest that the filibuster is not a concept that is central to the functioning of American democracy. It's actually a rather modern phenomenon in the grand scheme of the history of our country.
With a very dubious history in terms of its usage to block civil rights legislation such as our Senator Byrd from West Virginia blocked the 1964 Civil Rights Act. One other note really about West Virginia, we actually elected a Democratic governor, but after he was elected, he changed his registration to Republican. So we tried what we could. The third question we have from the political leanings, because there's some belief that were it not the political leanings of the District of Columbia, it may be an easier task in order to have this statehood. But the question that we have is, haven't other states like Alaska or Hawaii had political leanings before they were admitted? Why did that not block their admittance?
I would love to take this Pastor Fryson, as someone who moved to the District of Columbia from the great state of Idaho, that has a different political leaning, just a little bit of a different political leaning. People oftentimes forget that states in our nation didn't start as a specific political leaning.
Right.
The state of Idaho was, a Democratic stronghold for a number of years. Idaho was the first state in the nation that gave women the right to vote. Now it was to get women to move to the state so they could marry folks, and
Right.
but that's neither here nor there. But also, like, the state of Idaho gave this country frank church, if people remember, the frank church hearings. So, it was a democratic state and then changed. But I think we need to make a distinction here, between political and partisan.
Mm-hmm.
What we are doing here is a political action. It has to go through the political process. It is the system of government we have is a political one by nature, but this is not a partisan issue, and we should not be granting or denying people access to the fundamental way in a representational government that people can hold their government accountable, that they can debate what is good for their regions and states and the country. Denying that access on a partisan basis, that just should not be done. And Pastor Fryson, if you'll give me a little leeway here, I think one of the things, because we're talking to a West Virginia audience that doesn't live this from your day to day, I just think it's really important to understand that when we're talking about voting, we need to understand what this unlocks for us in this country. Like, this fundamental right is linked to how we experience everything in our lives in this country. And when you live in DC, essentially, number one, as was mentioned before, in DC, we did not have the right to vote for president until 1961. We did not have a governing body that we actually could vote for our own representatives to make our own laws until 1973. Now, DC has a functioning city council. A lot of people don't even know that. We have a functioning city council. We make our laws. We have a functioning school system, that we have an education budget. So if you think about, the West Virginia legislature, we have that in DC. That is our city council. It is, and we make all these laws. Now, the difference here is that we have to, all of our laws go through congressional review. So imagine that, just imagine for a second, that not only do you as West Virginians have to go and testify at the West Virginia state legislature and tell your government what you want as people, but then it would go to Congress, and then Congress can decide three different things. they can directly legislate on DC.
Mhm.
They can actually legislate directly on DC. So this entire body that none of us elected can do that. They can put riders on our budget. So there's this myth, and people say, oh, well, Congress controls DC's budget. They don't. It goes through the congressional appropriation, but we set our own budget. We spend our own money, and we pay a lot of taxes in DC. But they can put riders on our budget, telling us that we can't spend our own money on things. And so that plays out in a number of different ways in DC. And then they can also pass disapproval resolutions. And how we've seen this enacted all of those three things are lots of things like Congress denied us the right to spend our own money in the 1980s on a needle exchange program. And what that did is it skyrocketed the number of HIV/AIDS cases in the District of Columbia, something that we deal with all the way till today, because they didn't let us deal with our own issues the way we wanted to here in the District of Columbia. In the 1980s, district residents voted to repeal the death penalty. We took the death penalty off the books. Congress told the District of Columbia that they would have to have another referendum, put it on a referendum, and we had to pay for it. So that asked the district residents if the death penalty should be put back on the books, even after we had voted to take it off.
Amazing.
So I think in these ways, and a lot of people don't know, we have a bifurcated criminal justice system. So actually, U.S. attorneys, the under the Department of Justice, anyone who is charged with a felony in the District of Columbia, the prosecutor is not like the local prosecutor. It is the U.S. attorney. And then if you are, convicted, you go away to one of the Bureau of Prisons. You don't stay in the District of Columbia. So these are things where, it affects people's daily lives in the District of Columbia. And I think that is so important about voting and its fundamental representational way in government and what it unlocks. And I think once people start imagining how that would affect their own lives, if they had to do it in places like West Virginia, you understand how important this is.
Well, Counselor, you laid that out with an almost evangelistic fervor. And I can just say, man, and also that it makes us realize that until DC is free, it calls into question our whole democracy. And so we need to free the 700,000 citizens of DC to full citizenship, because the voting privilege is sacrosanct. So at this point, I'm going to ask each of you for about a 2-minute wrap up, and we'll start Dr. Perry.
Well, first of all, I want to thank everyone for this opportunity. I really do believe that we create change by sharing knowledge with each other and across communities, and then leaving these Zooms that we've all been on for the past year plus, and going into communities and actually making this action real. So really appreciate this opportunity, and do hope many West Virginians continue to join us in fighting for a statehood by lobbying, obviously, your senators, but also you are close by. So, you can drive on over and join us at many of the rallies and events that we have organized via DC Vote and our coalition partners. Secondly, what I will say is that as a scholar of political representation, this is centrally an issue of the fundamental rights that our Constitution has given citizens, and for African Americans who fought very hard for citizenship, finally granted in the 14th Amendment and ratified in 1868. In many instances, regardless whether you live in DC or not, this really is an issue that is central to your identity as an American. And whether or not you may agree with everything that your elected representatives do, quote unquote, on your behalf and in your name, nonetheless, the system is literally a system that is built by the people, which really does make the United States of America a unique place. Some people, I think, have chosen to use that and turn it into an American exceptionalist argument. But in terms of the framework of our country, where inherently the power does rest in the hands of eligible voters and citizens in general to make their voices heard by contacting their representatives. This really is an issue that is about more than just the 700,000 people who live here in the District of Columbia. This is truly an issue about the kind of Americans that we are, and the choice that we have to actually truly try to become that more perfect union. And that will only happen by the actions of everyday individual citizens in the 50 states that we are trying to join, and principally in West Virginia. We also know that this is, as Monica was saying, this is a political issue in a partisan time. And so we live in a current era where your participation is even more maximized than ever because of the numbers that we have in the Senate, that the voices of West Virginians in this effort for DC statehood really maximizes your individual political power as Americans. And I really hope to continue to see each and every one of you share in that power by trying to join us in making statehood a reality here in DC. We need your support, and it's also central to what it is to be an American, and your help in that effort is really much appreciated.
Well, Dr. Perry, we certainly appreciate you putting that in that context, because after rounding our first Juneteenth holiday from a federal government, and now as we're rounding to the July 4th, this is a matter of basic American patriotism that everyone has the right to vote. Chris, if you can give us two minutes, would it be greatly appreciated?
Sure. I actually want to end by talking about my mom. Because my mom she's an amazing American. She's the only child of a Census Bureau statistician and a Jewish social scientist who fled Germany because of the Nazis. She was born and raised in DC, still lives there. She had two children while attending medical school, another one, me, in Laos, where she was practicing medicine while my father served in Vietnam. She and my father was a foreign service officer. They served our country. We lived abroad. Came back to DC. She worked in pediatrics. She worked in a drug clinic during the height of the crack epidemic, and then spent the last couple decades of her career caring for veterans at Walter Reed Army Medical Center in DC. She has served this country abroad and in DC. She has served veterans of this country. She has lived a dedicated life as tremendous American citizen as you can imagine, but she can't vote. And in fact, she had more rights when we lived abroad, and my father could claim residency in California where he was raised. She had more rights there than she's had in the last 40 years when she's been living back in her home of DC. She still lives in the house I grew up in. She still does not have the right to vote. And I challenge every one of you to look in the mirror and explain why my mom should not be allowed to vote, and why 700,000 of her neighbors should be denied the right to vote simply because of where they live. It's just plain wrong. I think everybody in America knows it, but some people don't have the political courage to admit it.
Well, thank you. You have posed to us the unanswerable question, and we appreciate you putting in that light. Counselor, we're going to give you the last word.
Well, it's really hard to follow Chris because he articulated, you know, the lives, like really put a face on the lives of folks in DC and really feel it. So I'm going to give you some action steps because I love action steps. You know, I see in the chat, people are like, I learned so much. I'm with you. So now it's your turn. Now it's really important that you are talking to your friends and to your neighbors and speaking not only to your senators, but you know, I'm sure there are a lot of West Virginians that are saying like, I just don't get it. Why should DC get statehood? And sometimes it takes you to start that conversation with them. Hey, I just learned this really great thing because we can't do this for ourselves. So we encourage you to get even more informed, to turn to any of our organizations like, you know, the ACLU, there is DC Vote in DC that has more information as well. And to speak to your friends and neighbors about what you learned here and take action to ensure that your representatives know that you care and you want this for the residents of DC and more largely for our country, because it's disingenuous to say that we live in a democracy and a representative government when you have over 700,000 residents that can't actually vote.
Well, thank you so much. This has been a thrilling evening with three absolute experts on the field, and the way you have articulated should change any hearts of anyone that was privy to this information. In West Virginia, our motto is Montani Siempre Liberi. Mountaineers are always free. Because mountaineers are always free, our endeavor should be to help other people to retain their freedom. And so I am asking all West Virginians to continue to be on the march, to be in support of DC statehood. I thank you so much for joining us tonight, and I thank each and every one of you for being here, and I thank you, expert panel, for your participation and your expertise. Thank you so very much, and good night.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, Pastor.